welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page. I'm Jen, your host for today, and I'm here with a really old friend from back in the days and a really fabulous writer. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, my name's Alex Segura. It's great to be here. I am the author of Secret Identity, a noir murder mystery set in 1975 New York City in the comic book industry. And it follows a queer Cuban-American woman, Carmen Valdez, who moves from Miami to New York to pursue her dream of writing comics, and finds that dream is blocked off by her boss at this third-rate publisher called Triumph Comics. He basically says, look, I have a lot of friends I need to keep paid, and I have other plans for you, which is obviously not what Carmen wants. And so she's approached by a younger colleague named Harvey, who says, I have this opportunity to launch a new superhero in the Triumph universe. And I know you're a fan, and I'd love for you to collaborate with me. The only wrinkle being you'd have to do it anonymously. But this is Carmen's dream, so she does it. And they create this character called the Legendary Lynx, and it becomes a huge hit for Triumph. The only problem is Harvey is murdered. And so nobody knows Carmen's created this character, so she has to not only solve the mystery because of her friend, Harvey, but also because she wants to reclaim this character that's so near and dear to her heart. And the novel Secret Identity also has comic book interstitial sequences drawn by Sandy Jarrell, who is an amazing comic book artist. And so you get the mystery, and you also kind of get to see the creative comic they've created, the comic book they've created. So it was fun. Great. Happy to be here.
I absolutely love the structure of this book with like the comic within the novel. And I have so many questions about New York and Miami and comics and everything. But before we get to the book itself, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your writing history, because you are astonishingly prolific. You've
Thanks.
written
Yeah.
across genre and media of all different kinds. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what you've written and how this book kind of fits into your interests and your writing.
For sure. Yeah. I always knew I wanted to write. I think even before I kind of understood what it meant to be a writer. I think as kids we create stories and we draw I drew little comics and was very into narrative and being creative, a creative writer. And my first, I guess, big work was Silent City, which was my first novel, a mystery novel about a private investigator in Miami. And I wrote that when I got my first kind of professional comic book gig, working at DC Comics in publicity. And I think it was a byproduct of being homesick, having just moved to New York. And so that really was the first thing. And, I ended up doing 5 books in that series, but also at the same time, writing comic books like for Archie and other places. And I've written a lot of, like you said, I've written a lot of things in different genres, like sci-fi, like a Poe Dameron Star Wars novel, different comic books, whether they're company comics like Archie stuff or for DC or for Marvel, but also my own creator-owned stuff like The Black Ghost or The Awakened and things like that. So I like to read in multiple genres and different spaces and different mediums. And so that's kind of where my writing gravitates. I'll always have a spot for mystery and crime fiction and also comics. And so that's kind of what Secret Identity is. It's like the nexus point of a lot of things I love, like, New York in the 70s, Miami, all my stories seem to gravitate back to Miami and Cuban American characters. And so it was important to make sure Carmen reflected that. And so in many ways, Secret Identity is a synthesis of a lot of different influences and things that I've written before all in one place. And so it's really been great to see the response be so positive.
Yeah, this book I saved it for this week because
oh, cool.
When I saw you at Comic-Con, we had just booked a trip to Miami actually for Thanksgiving. We were like, let's skip the family stuff. Let's go to Miami. And it was my first time there and I loved it. Like it's such a great city. And
Yeah.
it was really special to get to read this like right after having encountering the city for the first time. And I'm wondering like because this book does like represent the intersection of two places, two cities that are very important to you, like Miami and New York.
Mhm.
And like what of your own experience of those places like makes its way into the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, it's like the duality of both places. Like they're so different, but also so important to me. And I think Carmen and I share that feeling of almost otherness in terms of just you have this home and this culture and this background that you is so informs your life in so many ways, and then you uproot yourself and go somewhere else. And New York is so different. And I think, being, I've been a New Yorker for a long time now, but that initial period was so formative for me because New York can be a very lonely place, I think, especially if you're new to the city and it's overwhelming. You're surrounded by people and information and just change, and it's just a lot to process. And I wanted to relay that, but in a New York that doesn't really exist anymore, and in a comic book industry that doesn't exist anymore, while not losing where Carmen was from. And I think, she even the story, the narrative of the story happens mainly in New York, and you get flashbacks to Miami, but you also hopefully get a sense that Miami is part of her DNA and part of who she is, and hard for her to kind of shake. Not that she wants to, but it's just part of what she does and everything. So there's a lot of me in that, but it's obviously a different time period. I'm not Carmen. I'm not, I never worked in comics at that time. So there was a lot of research that went into the book to make it ring true and feel genuine, which was fun and also an unexpected part of the journey.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about research because you really bring the city in the 70s to life in a really vibrant way, as well as the comic book industry at the time.
Oh, cool.
And I
Thank
think
you.
that you're welcome. And something that really, interested me about this might be a little bit of a left turn of a question, but, when people think about comics and they're not, super familiar with them, I feel like they tend to think about like now in like the era of the extended universe where it saturates us, or they think about like the golden age, like when all these characters were being invented and,
Mhm.
they remember from their childhoods. Like what do you think made comics in the 70s special? Because I feel like people don't talk like think about that time a lot for it, but it was like a really transformative moment. And so I'm wondering
Yeah.
like what drew you to that time period that made you want to set it there and talk about comics in that age.
Yeah, it's definitely an underappreciated beat, I guess, in the history of comics. And I found it really fascinating because it stands in such stark contrast to comics today, or at least pop culture. Like, um, comic books now are just woven into our day-to-day like idea space, I guess. We have a Moon Knight TV show, like an Ant-Man movie, or like Peacemaker or Suicide Squad, like all these characters that even for me as a kid reading comics in the 90s or starting to become a comic fan were not B-listers, but just were not part of like the big idea of comics. And comics always felt like this insidery thing that it was a hobby. It didn't feel like everyone was into comics. And now this is not a criticism. It's actually awesome that, comics are so widespread in their awareness, or at least in the characters are so widespread. But in the 70s, there was this real sense that comics were dying. There was not, you didn't have comic shops yet. You had newsstands. So you would go into a grocery store and kids would buy comics theoretically, but the business model was really flawed in that companies had to overprint so much just to get that very prime real estate in newsstands, and there was no guarantees that the books were going to succeed. And so I think there was this sense that, without the movies and without television, there was no real idea that comics were going to be what they are now. And it was kind of, a thing you did. It was creative for sure, but it was a job. You did it and you cranked out your scripts, or you drew your comics, and then you went on to the next thing. It was much more of a making the donuts kind of approach, like, as opposed to now it's all about intellectual property and multi-platform media. And like you create a comic and you hope that it becomes something else, but there's a path, I guess. And creators are rightfully much more concerned about ownership, and they're, having control of their ideas, as they should, as artists. But I think back then it was very much like, I'm hired to do this job and I'm going to do it. And I love maybe you were a fan, but fandom as it exists now didn't then. It's much more something you created as a gig, and I think I wanted to show that contrast because I think everyone is aware of comics now through the modern day, but there was a time when comics were not what they are, and definitely New York was very different. Comics were very different, and so I wanted to kind of present that in a way where someone that's informed today could see the differences and be like, oh, that's interesting that there was a time that this was a very insular industry, and it still is insular in a different way, but I definitely wanted to showcase that. It made for an interesting backdrop for a murder mystery.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it marries like two of, your big writing interests. And I found out that there were like a lot more links between them than I thought. Like, so
Hmm.
for instance, like you open the book with a quote from Jack Kirby and one from Patricia Highsmith. And I was like, oh, that's so nice. Like one person from comics, one person from, mystery.
Yeah.
And in the book, I learned that like Patricia Highsmith wrote comics too. And I was like, wow, that's so cool. So there has always kind of been these linkages, between.
Yeah, I feel like Patricia Highsmith, I mean, I love her work and I think she writes in a way, her prose obviously is mesmerizing, but also she does this thing where she presents characters that are in the gray area, like not heroes and not villains. And I hope that when you read Secret Identity, you realize obviously Carmen is the hero and the protagonist, but all the other characters are very flawed individuals that aren't necessarily good or bad. And I think that's something she does really well in her novels. And yeah, she wrote comics in the golden age, and I thought she was such a important linchpin to the book, kind of hovering around the periphery. And she's mentioned, the price of salt is a huge influence on Secret Identity and all her other work. And yeah, there's a lot of that, a lot of like the Venn diagram of comics and noir. Hopefully that's where Secret Identity falls.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. And I love like I love both of those, areas of creative writing and production, and it's really fun to see them married here.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So kind of like a weird tangential question again, but like when you're writing something that is your own work, not something for an IP, and you
Mhm.
get an idea for a story, um what tells you that something should be a novel or a comic?
That's a great question. And it's also, I think, related to, the mediums are so different. Like comics are so collaborative. You're very much working, you have to be comfortable with your idea being taken by somebody else and tweaked and theoretically improved upon. You hope that the artist is going to take your idea, add to it, and make it greater than you ever anticipated. Like the thrill of comics is you send in the script or the story and the artist makes it better, and great artists do that. They make it into something that you never anticipated, and that's the fun, I guess, the alchemy of comics. But you also have to be up for that. And I think as creative people, there are ideas that pop into your head and you're like, yeah, I want to jam with someone on that. It's almost like music, like you're in a band, like you bring in a song and you want the other band members to add to it. But then there's also ideas that feel so personal and so just you that you selfishly just want to execute it on your own. And the funny thing about Secret Identity is that it felt like that. It was like, this is so me. Like, this is something that really feels personal and private, and like something that's so unique to my life that I want to just take control it, selfishly. But then on the flip side, you also have these sequences in the novel that are comic books. And I had to find a partner, a creative partner that understood that and also had that sense of history and love for the medium of that time. And that's where Sandy was perfect. I've known Sandy a long time. He's a friend. We had this shorthand where I could, he understood immediately when I said, he was the first person I approached, and he understood immediately what I was trying to do and how we were trying to weave something into literal history. And I kind of love how the character has almost manifested itself, the Lynx particularly, like we've woven it into comic book history that we could almost like will it into existence. Like, and so, we're now working on actual Lynx comics, but with the conceit that these actually happened, with a wink and a nod, they'll be presented as like written by Harvey Stern, wink, wink, or drawn by Doug Detmer, but it's me and Sandy, um, because we both love the medium so much. And so I guess to answer your question, sorry for that tangent, but to answer it, it really depends on what you think the idea needs in terms of collaboration. And also, like, if it's a very visual idea, then it would benefit from being a comic. And so I usually tend to know instinctually where I want it to land. Like Secret Identity always felt like a novel to me. It felt like a noir, a very moody piece of that era that was rooted in prose. But I think the comic book flourishes really add to it.
Hmm.
I hope.
You do. Yeah, it's really fun to, see how the text and the comic interact too, because like in the text, you learn stuff about the context of the comic in like little drips and drabs. And so like it changes its meaning, of course, as you go through the story and you read it. And I,
Oh, good. I'm so glad that worked because I think one of my fears too, just to be totally like real about it, was like I didn't want people to think, oh, he's just like showing off, like he's putting in the comic stuff just to do it and it's not additive. Like I think sometimes when you have these mashups, if the two things being kind of woven together don't add to each other, it feels almost like performative. And I wanted it to be essential. Like you need to read the comic sequences to fully understand like Carmen's struggle. Like there's a moment without spoiling too much where she realizes that the comic, and it's so funny that comic people that didn't know comics realized, oh, other people write them, like they get taken away, like they're assigned to other creative people. And there's this moment where she realizes that the links is going to be taken away, like someone is going to, once they're through the script she wrote, someone else is going to write it. And that felt so not shocking, she knows the business, but it felt so frightening to her that someone else was going to write this character. And so there's that page where you actually see somebody else's take on the character. And it's, I wanted that back and forth, that kind of conversation between the mediums to really feel important and not just illustrations that accompany a novel.
Mm. Yeah, there is like this very interesting tension when you're writing comics and collaborating with an artist, and not just an artist, but like, a colorist and an inker and
Hmm.
everybody who's involved. You have to sort of own your part of the process, but also like be willing to sort of let go, of like things that might have mattered to you, like to make space for like somebody else's contribution. And you
Yeah.
do learn a lot of, I think, about like I don't know, it's very therapeutic in a lot of ways, working with an artist. I'm like, oh, I'm like way better at communication now than I used to be.
Yeah, no, it's really fun because you kind of think about, well, what do I definitely want in there, and where do I have room to play, and where do I want like an artist to have room to do what they want to do. Like you want it to always feel like an equal partnership. And obviously, Secret Identity is unique because it was my idea and it was something that I had kind of formatted. But I definitely wanted Sandy to evoke the comics he loved and evoke his style and bring that into it in a way that felt cool and interesting.
One thing that I really liked about it too is that it portrayed the day-to-day of working in comics in a way that like, as you were kind of saying before, like depicts it as something of a slog, and
Yeah.
like you're underappreciated and overworked and all these things, but you also convey really well like the reasons why people stick with it, like why they get into it and why it matters to them and why they're willing sometimes to deal with like really tough
Oh, good.
work situations. And I'm wondering, like, what about your own experience working on the other side of, the comics desk too? Like you, because you've experienced the industry from so many angles. Like,
Mhm.
how did that make its way into the book too?
Yeah, it was really a blessing to have that experience of not just being a writer, but also having worn other hats, like an editor or a publishing type role or a marketing person. And so you kind of got to see how the sausage was made from different angles. And I kind of hate that term because it's kind of gross, but it's also the idea that you see how things come together, how the books are put together, what the colorist does, what the letterer does. And I feel like there's this running sense in comics, even today, that, there's you do it because you love it. You don't do it for the payday. You don't do it necessarily for acclaim, but you do it because you love the medium and you love this kind of fusion of a visual and literal storytelling. I wanted to showcase that, this idea that everyone's in the trenches because they're passionate for the medium, and I think it's a much more prevalent, much more imperative in that time period, because now I think there's an awareness to comics and to the medium that wasn't there then. And so, Carmen is almost working in secret. And there's this great book that I think I nod to in the acknowledgments called The 10 Cent Plague by David Haju. And it's about this crackdown that happened in comics in the 50s in two horror comics, congressional crackdown, cultural crackdown about the content. And at the beginning of the book, he interviews this woman that worked in comics during that time. And then after the crackdown happened, she basically disappeared. And that was really like a fire starter moment for me when I read that, because I knew I had this idea. I wanted it to be comics. I wanted it to be a mystery. I wanted it to be kind of in the 70s, but Carmen hadn't walked into my brain yet. She hadn't shown up. And then when I read that, I was like, well, that's who it's got to be. And then she appeared, and kind of you set the table and you hope that the characters show up to have the meal. But that's what really resonated for me, is to show this person that loves the medium so much that she's willing to do it no matter what, and she's willing to write the story and create this character and really pour her ideas into this thing, knowing that she'll never own it, because, and then I think the point that makes the breaking point for her is when she's like, it's being taken away, like even beyond, like I can't even like write it in secret anymore, like someone else is going to take it. And so I wanted to show just how strong her love for comics had to be for that to happen.
Yeah, she's put into such a constrained space, in terms of what she can make and what she can like command about her own work, and even who can see her work. And that a lot of that, I think, is because of like the industry at that time, and also her identity, and being an outsider in her office, all these different things. But it does really speak to her passion that she's willing to endure like this pretty not so great,
Yeah, not ideal.
Get her stories out there.
Yeah.
And the way that like the links comes from, not only just her creative impulses, but from so much of her experience as a woman in Miami, and as a Latina woman, and as a transplant in New York, so much is informing that character. I had a question about one particular scene.
Yeah.
There's a scene where Carmen goes to a writing class at Florida International, and she sees a professor speak. And I actually I Googled the professor's name to see if it was a real person. But I wondered if was that inspired by a real person or by a real writing mentor of yours?
Yes, it's so funny that you bring that up, because I ran into her, Alexandra Leighton, who was my first creative writing teacher at FIU. Ironically, it was like a creative 102 class, like a very introductory poetry class. So yeah, I mean, there's a ton of little nods and hat tips to people. Like, it's never a one for one. Like, there's a character named Rich Berger, who's a comic book editor, and obviously everyone knows Karen Berger, who's this legendary like founder of Vertigo and a friend of mine. And so they're not meant to be like, oh, that's her, or this is her, but it's just my opportunity to kind of tip the hat at people who were helpful to me in my journey creatively and as just a human. And so, yeah, definitely that was a little wink to my teacher, and a thank you. And I did get to talk to her about it. Like, she knew I mentioned to her, I was like, hey, this character is named after you in this book. And then we got to talk about it at Miami Book Fair. We ran into each other in Miami not long ago, and she got to pick up the book, and I got to dedicate a copy to her, which was really awesome for me. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that. It's a very personal book for me, just to have those little moments to people that were important. And also, just, you never want it to take away from the book. I want people to read it, and if they don't get the jokes, they don't get who these characters are, but they enjoy the story, like it's a page turner, that's what matters to me. But for someone to read it and also pick up on these little Easter eggs, that's cool too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I noticed that a mutual friend of ours was in there too. There's a character named Trunick.
Yeah.
Our friend Austin Trunick has been on this show too. He talked about his.
Oh, it's such a great book. Yeah, I mean, it's very much an Austin book, like that. He can go into so much detail into this like very obscure Hollywood production company. It's so fascinating. We were talking about it not long ago, just kind of. It's so him. But yeah, Austin and I work together at DC, and there's a little Greek chorus of characters in Triumph Comics, like Han and Trunick and Mullen and other characters that are just kind of around. So those are just like opportunities to like say thanks to people in a very low key way.
Yeah, it's nice to do that, because me and my writing partner and artist Sophie also love to sort of like name drop people or base.
Oh, how is Sophie doing?
Great. She's great. There's, we're writing our next comic right now.
Awesome.
So yeah, it's fun to be back in comics. And this is a great book to read like while you are trying to get your head back in comics after a little bit of time away. You get like so immersed in the world. And it does like a great job of like reminding you like how much there is to love about comics and the making of them and the people who make them and reading them. And
Oh, good.
like, yeah, it's a really beautiful love letter, a realistic one, and like not, not a rose-colored glasses one, but like still a
Yeah,
love.
warts and all. Hopefully, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Um, are you working on anything at the moment that you're able to talk about, or what's next for you?
Yeah, I mean, literally coming out next in a couple months, early next year, is a YA superhero novel, Marvel novel called Araña Spider-Man 2099 Dark Tomorrow. And so it's a team up between two of the most prominent like Latinx spider heroes in a kind of Spider-Verse type adventure. And so that's coming out in May. And I'm working on a book called Alter Ego, which is a sort of sequel to Secret Identity. It'll be set in the modern day and feature a new protagonist who once worked in comics. She was an artist in comics and left the industry. She just got burnt out on comics and took a job as a storyboard artist in movies. And so that, becomes her career, and she's a mom, and she's kind of, not in the industry, but then she sees an announcement that a company has been formed to pursue media opportunities for a library of characters based on this old comic book company called Triumph Comics. And so they're relaunching this character, this obscure 70s character called the Lynx, and she's then approached to take a pass at drawing the character. And so she loves this character. She grew up reading the character, but it also pulls her into this darker mystery of the origins of the character and who actually created it. And you find out that she's much more intrinsically tied to it than you first thought, in terms of her role in the character, or what her role is in the creation of the character. But it opens the door to Carmen coming back. And I think the best way to get a sense of what this book is going to be is to read the epilogue of Secret Identity, which tease it up in a very direct and indirect way. You kind of meet a character that's essential to the book, but you also kind of get a sense thematically of what it might be. And so that, the epilogue of the book was not in the first draft. And then I was talking to Zach Wagman, my editor, who is amazing and such a great collaborator. And he's like, I think people will want to know what happens to Carmen, or at least have an idea of what might happen without spoiling too much of the book. And so that's really where Alter Ego springs out of. So Carmen shows up in some degree. She's not the star of the book, because I think she had her moment. Secret Identity is very much Carmen's moment, but you can't tell a story about the Lynx or these characters without her being there. So I think the interplay between Carmen and the new protagonist, Annie, is been the most fun part of the book.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I'm so excited
I hope, yeah. And it's like a little an analysis of fandom and what happens when the things we love are kind of flawed through their creators. Like, when something you are so passionate about as a fan becomes twisted because the talent behind it or the companies behind it aren't acting the way you would want. Like, what happens? And that's been an interesting journey for me as a fan of so many different things. Like, how do I feel when it just doesn't go the way I think it should go? And like, there's a lot to chew on there, and it's definitely not an answer. It's more just like echoing the question.
As you were speaking, like that sort of recontextualized the epilogue for me too, because I'm like, ooh, so intrigued. But while you were talking, I'm like, you know what? Like it feels almost like a post-credit scene,
Yeah, it's definitely like a stinger. Like you
Yeah.
could have the book and it could end the way it ends, and that's it, and it becomes this very finite standalone. And then you see the post-credit scene, and you're like, oh, there's more to this. And that's where I'm at now, which has been fun to explore. And it's definitely been hard, because I always saw Secret Identity as this own singular thing, and it can be. And I want this book to stand on its own, the sequel to stand on its own and be its own thing too. But if you read them both, you get something more out of it.
I mean, sometimes like hinting at the wider world can, in a paradoxical way, like make your thing like more alive in a way, because you're hinting at like what lies beyond it, and that kind of grounds it more. That was not as coherent a thought as I wanted it to.
No, I get it. Yeah, and I guess that's been the challenge of writing this book, because I definitely want it to be. I mean, it's always going to be couched like this is the sequel, but it's not a sequel in the way like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a sequel. Like it picks up. It's like literally chapter 2. Like this is a thing that happens in the same world. It involves some of the similar themes and characters and moments, but it's very much its own thing, and it explores them in the way that Secret Identity explores like creation and how important creation is, and identifying with your creation. This is much more about that, but also like carrying the torch on an idea and what the weight of that brings and what happens when you realize that there's more to the characters you're working on than you first thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so exciting. I love when that happens. And I like to think of it as like they are different stars in a constellation,
Yeah,
like
yeah, exactly. It's not just like 1 and 2. It's just they're kind of in the same space. Time has passed. And I think people want to see what Carmen's up to some degree. I hope. I do too. Yeah. As I write it, I'm
hope
like,
I'm
what is she doing?
representative of everybody.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming to talk with us. I love this conversation and I love this book, and I am so deeply excited for your next 2 projects because they
Oh,
both
thank you.
so great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was so great to reconnect at the con and to have this opportunity to chat. And I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you are welcome back anytime. Like, I hope you'll
For
talk
sure.
about both these projects with us. So
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again.
no problem. All right, listeners, you can pick up Secret Identity as of this moment at your favorite bookstore or library, whichever place you like to get your books. Check it out. I highly recommend it. This has been Jen in conversation with Alex Segura, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.